Welcome back, guys, to Mr. Cursed. Today I'm telling you 5 true scary stories from the Appalachian Mountains. These are real encounters with creepy legends that will give you goosebumps. You won't believe what people have seen in those dark mountains. But before we start, please hit subscribe and don't forget to like and share this with your friends. Let me know where you're watching from. Thanks, everyone. Now let's get into these scary stories. I was 19 that October, working part-time at Murphy's Hardware while trying to figure out what the hell to do with my life after high school. My name's Brian, and I'd been living with my Aunt Martha in eastern Kentucky since my parents' divorce got ugly the year before. Martha had this little house about 40 minutes outside of Hazard, nothing fancy, but it beat listening to Mom and Dad scream at each other every night. I was planning to maybe go to community college in the spring, save up some money, you know how it is. But then Uncle Dale went missing, and everything changed. Dale was Martha's older brother, been hunting these mountains since he was 12 years old. Guy knew every trail, every hollow, every deer stand for 50 miles around. He'd go out for a weekend hunting trip maybe once a month, sometimes twice during season, but he never stayed gone more than 3 days. Never. That was his rule, 3 days max, then back home to check on things. When he didn't come back after 2 weeks, Martha started getting real worried. She kept calling his cell phone, but it just went straight to voicemail every time. See, Dale had this old hunting cabin up in Rattlesnake Hollow, about 23 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by all these abandoned coal mines from back in the 40s. Real remote area, the kind of place where your GPS stops working and you better know the roads by heart. My cousin Jake was supposed to drive up there with me to check on Dale, but he got called into work at the last minute. Overtime pay he couldn't afford to turn down. Martha begged me to go alone just to make sure Dale was okay. Maybe bring him home if his truck broke down or something. The drive up there took about an hour and a half on these winding back roads that got narrower and nastier the further you went. I stopped for gas at this little station in Buckhorn, and man, Bish said when I mentioned to the old guy behind the counter that I was heading up to Rattlesnake Hollow, he went real quiet. Just looked at me for a long second, then muttered something about getting back before dark. Didn't think much of it at the time. Mountain people can be strange about certain places, you know? Family stories and local legends and all that. From where I parked Dale's old Ford Ranger, it was about a 4-mile hike up this trail that was marked by pieces of rusted mining equipment slowly being swallowed up by the forest. Old conveyor belts wrapped around trees, broken rail cars sitting in clearings full of kudzu. The whole area had this weird feeling to it, like the woods were too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering, just my footsteps crunching through the leaves. When I finally got to the cabin, Dale's truck was parked perfectly in the clearing, keys still in the ignition, but the battery was dead and the driver's door was wide open. That should have been my first real warning sign. Dale was careful about his truck. He'd never leave the door open like that, especially not for 2 weeks. Inside the cabin, the coffee pot had burned completely dry on the stove, and there was this calendar on the wall marked up until October 10th. It was the 15th when I got there. I called out his name a few times, but something was wrong with the echo. Instead of just bouncing back once like normal, it kept going, multiplying and overlapping like a dozen different voices were answering me from different directions. Made my skin crawl, honestly. I figured maybe it was just the way sound carried in that particular hollow, but it didn't feel right. That's when I decided to check the area behind the cabin. Dale had mentioned there was a small clearing back there where he sometimes set up a camp chair to watch for deer in the evenings. I followed this little PA, through the trees for maybe 200 yards, and that's where I found them. At first, I thought the trees were diseased. They had these white patches all over the bark that I figured were some kind of fungus or maybe mineral deposits from the old mining operations. But as I got closer, I realized what I was really looking at. Those white patches weren't fungus. They were bones. Human bones, pressed into the bark and actually grown into the wood itself, like the trees had somehow absorbed them. The bones were scattered randomly across maybe a dozen different trees, some at eye level, others 20 feet up in the branches. There was no pattern to it, no organization, just bones fused with bark at different heights. And that's when I saw Uncle Dale's Marine Corps ring, still on a finger bone that was embedded in this big oak tree, with the bark actually growing around the metal band. I'd like to say I kept my cool, but I didn't. I stumbled backward and almost fell over a root, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. These weren't old bones either. Some of them still had tissue clinging to them, while others were completely absorbed into the wood like they'd been there for years. The trees themselves were making these wet, wheezing sounds, irregular rhythm, like lungs filled with tree sap trying to work. When I touched one of the bone joints, this red sap leaked out and ran down the bark. It was warm, body temperature, and it smelled like copper pennies mixed with pine pitch. The ground around the trees was normal, though. No graves, no disturbed earth, no drag marks. Whatever had happened to these people, they hadn't been buried. They'd been absorbed standing up. I tried to take pictures with my phone, thinking maybe I could show them to the police or something, but every photo came out wrong. Instead of showing the bone trees, the images showed blurred human shapes standing where the trees were, like transparent people overlapping with the bark. And some of the bones were still moving slightly. Fingers twitching, ribs expanding with that awful wheezing sound. As the sun started going down, the wheezing got louder and turned into something that sounded almost like voices. Wordless moaning from inside the wood like people trying to talk through tree bark. Then the oak tree with Dale's ring started calling out, "Martha, Martha," in what sounded exactly like my uncle's voice, but damaged somehow, like his throat was full of sawdust. That's when the ground erupted around my feet. Roots burst up through the dead leaves like tentacles, wrapping around my ankles with this incredible strength, trying to drag me toward an empty spot between two of the bone trees. I pulled out my pocket knife and started cutting at them, and they bled real human blood, hot and arterial, spraying across the leaves. I managed to grab onto Dale's truck bumper and held on while these roots stretched me between the truck and the trees, like some kind of nightmare tug-of-war. Where the roots touched my skin, this numbness started spreading, and when I looked down at my ankle, I could see bark texture starting to grow across my skin. I remembered Dale always kept a cigarette lighter in his truck, even though he'd quit smoking years ago. Found it in the glove compartment, still full of fluid, and I burned every root I could reach. The trees screamed when I did that. Actually screamed with human voices, men and women, maybe decades worth of victims all crying out at once. The roots let me go, but my left ankle was already partially wooden. My toes fused together, the skin rough like bark. I could barely walk on it, and every time I stopped moving for more than a few seconds, I could feel it trying to root into the ground. Looking back now, I think Dale had figured out what was happening up there. In the back of his truck, I found 5 gas cans, all full. He'd been planning to burn something. Nang, probably the same thing I was thinking about. These trees had been feeding for who knows how long, taking people who wandered into that clearing, and they'd keep doing it unless someone stopped them. My wooden foot was getting worse by the minute, the bark creeping up toward my knee. I figured I had maybe an hour before I couldn't move at all. That's when I made the decision that still keeps me up at night sometimes. I doused a wide circle around all the bone trees with Dale's gasoline, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the can steady. The trees seemed to sense what I was planning. Their branches started reaching toward me, more roots surfacing, trying to stop me. The oak tree kept pleading in Dale's voice, sounding exactly like him. "Brian, don't do this. I'm still alive in here." But I knew better. Whatever was talking, it wasn't really my uncle anymore. When I lit that circle, the whole clearing exploded in flames. The bone trees shrieked with the voices of everyone they'd ever taken, this horrible chorus of the dead that I can still hear sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep. As they burned, partially absorbed people started falling out of the bark, some who'd been taken days ago, some who looked like they'd been in there for years. They aged rapidly once they hit the ground, decades of time catching up with them in seconds. Uncle Dale collapsed out of that oak tree, still alive but changed. He'd aged maybe 20 years in the space of a few heartbeats, and parts of his body were still partially wooden. I dragged him back to his truck while my wooden leg crumbled away to ash, leaving behind scarred flesh that burned like hell but at least worked like a normal foot again. The fire spread beyond my gasoline circle and ended up burning most of the hollow. Dale survived, but he's never been the same. He doesn't talk much anymore, just sits on Martha's front porch and stares off toward the mountains. My leg healed up, but it's covered in these bark-patterned scars that look like tree rings when the light hits them right. The state called it a forest fire, natural causes, but 3 years later, nothing grows in that hollow. The ground is still bare, just ash and burned stumps. Sometimes, though, when I'm driving those back roads at night, I swear I can still hear that wheezing sound drifting down from the mountains. And I never, ever go hiking alone anymore. Back when I was 31, I was making decent money as a freelance web designer, working from my apartment in Nashville. Photography was just a hobby then, something I did on weekends to get away from screens and code. I'd been building up my Instagram for a couple years, posting landscape shots around Tennessee, trying to hit those spots nobody else had found yet. I wasn't famous or anything, but I had a good eye, and honestly, I thought if I could just find that one perfect location, that one shot nobody had seen before, it might change everything for me. That's what led me to Devil's Wash Basin. I found out about the place on this old hiking forum. Most of the posts were the usual tourist trap stuff, but buried deep in the comments, someone mentioned Devil's Wash Basin and these ghost photographers from the 1800s that supposedly still roamed around taking pictures. Obviously, I figured it was just some local legend cooked up to bring in tourists. But the location itself sounded incredible. A perfectly round valley hidden in the mountains near the Tennessee-Kentucky border, accessible only by this dangerous narrow trail that took most of the day to hike. The forum post said there was a pond in the center that bubbled constantly and stayed exactly body temperature year-round, creating this ethereal mist that would make for amazing shots. My girlfriend Sarah wanted to come with me, but I insisted on going alone. Looking back now, I was being stubborn and probably showing off. I wanted to prove I could handle the dangerous hike by myself, and honestly, I wanted all the credit for discovering this place. She wasn't happy about it, but I promised I'd be careful and back by Sunday night. The drive took about 4 hours, winding through mountain roads that got progressively narrower and more forgotten. I parked at what used to be a trailhead, just a rusted sign and a patch of gravel where the asphalt gave up. The trail started out normal enough, but after the first hour, it got serious. I'm talking narrow ledges carved into cliff faces, sections where you had to use ropes, places where one wrong step meant a 100-foot drop. By the time I made it to the final descent, I understood why hardly anyone visited this place. 6 hours later, I saw it. The valley was unlike anything I'd ever encountered. Perfectly circular, maybe 200 yards across, surrounded by sheer cliff walls that rose straight up like someone had carved it out with a giant cookie cutter. The geometric precision was unsettling. Nature doesn't usually work in perfect circles, but there it was. And right in the dead center sat this pond, about 30 feet across, with steam rising off the surface, even though the air was cool. But what really caught my attention was all the old photography equipment scattered around the valley floor. Wooden tripods, glass bottles full of chemicals, brass lenses, leather camera bags. All of it looked like it was from the 1860s or something. The weird thing was, none of it looked weathered. The leather was still supple, the metal wasn't rusted, and when I picked up one of the chemical bottles, the liquid inside was still clear and moved like it was fresh. I set up my modern gear and started shooting, but I kept glancing at that antique equipment. It was positioned all around the pond like someone had been in the middle of a photo session and just vanished. The whole valley felt wrong in a way I couldn't put my finger on. Too quiet. No birds, no insects, not even wind. Just the sound of that pond bubbling and my own breathing. As the sun started getting low, hitting that perfect golden hour angle, they appeared. 4 men in Victorian-era clothing materialized around the pond like they'd always been there. Not transparent like movie ghosts, solid. Casting real shadows, adjusting their antique cameras with practiced hands. They were completely focused on their work, setting up shots of the empty pond surface with the kind of intense concentration you'd expect from professional photographers working on something crucial. I started walking toward them, camera ready, thinking this was either the best historical reenactment I'd ever stumbled across or the shot that would make my career. But when they turned to look at me in perfect unison, I saw their eyes. Instead of normal irises, each man's eyes showed sepia photographs. Different people, all old portraits of faces I'd never seen, all wearing expressions of absolute terror. The tallest one spoke in an accent I couldn't place, something old-fashioned and formal. "You're early. The gathering isn't until the equinox." I looked down at my watch, but it had stopped. My phone was showing random times: 3:47 a.m., then 11:23 p.m., then 6:15 a.m. The sun hadn't moved, but the shadows kept shifting around us like time was broken. "What gathering?" I managed to ask, but they'd already turned back to their work. They were photographing the empty pond surface, treating each shot like it was the most important thing in the world. But when they developed the glass plates right there using the pond water as developing fluid, the images showed people. Dozens of people from different time periods, all standing in the exact same spot where I was standing, all looking in the same direction with the same horrified expression. The shortest photographer looked up at me again. "We'll take your portrait," he said. "Preserve you properly. You have the eye of an artist." That's when I noticed the waterfall behind me and the cave entrance it was hiding. The sound of rushing water had covered up what was inside, thousands upon thousands of glass plate photographs hanging from the cave walls, dating back centuries. Some were labeled with dates from the 1600s, decades before photography was even invented, but they all showed this same valley, this same pond, and people who looked like they were screaming. Every single photograph showed a missing person from these mountains. I could tell because they all had that look, that specific expression of someone who knows they're never going home, and they were all standing in the exact spot where I was standing. I found a plate near the back that was dated tomorrow's date. It showed me standing by the pond in a shirt I hadn't even unpacked yet, my face frozen in the same terrified expression as everyone else. The pond wasn't water. It was developing fluid. The whole thing was like a massive photographic chemical bath, staying at exactly 98.6 degrees because it was absorbing human essence. Every person they photographed, every soul they captured, fed it. And the people in the photographs were moving. Slightly, but definitely moving. Eyes tracking me as I walked past, mouths forming silent screams, hands pressed against the glass like they were trapped behind it, which I realized they were. I felt this overwhelming urge to walk to the spot where my future photograph showed me standing. It was like a compulsion, getting stronger every second. But I fought it, backing away from the pond, and that's when I noticed all 4 photographers flickering like old film. They needed a specific number of photos per cycle, and if they didn't get them, they started to fade. I tried to leave then, but every path led back to the pond. The trail I'd come down just looped around and dumped me back at the water's edge. I was trapped, and my phone was completely dead now. That's when I started paying attention to their reflections. All 4 photographers showed up perfectly in the pond when they stood at certain angles, but their reflections moved independently, like they were trapped in the water while their bodies worked above. I threw a rock into the pond to test my theory, and all 4 of them flinched at exactly the same moment. They were connected to it somehow, bound to this place the same way their victims were bound to the photographs. The oldest photographer noticed me watching and walked over. "We were the first," he said. "Found this place in 1847, took 1 photograph of the pond thinking we'd discovered something beautiful. Been here ever since. Every equinox we must add to the collection or our own photographs in the cave start fading. You understand? We're trapped by the same process we use to trap others." I spent the whole night figuring out their rules, testing theories, nearly getting myself photographed a dozen times. But by dawn, I had a plan. I pretended to agree to let them take my portrait, but I asked them to show me proper Victorian posing techniques first. I convinced them I needed to understand their composition style, their artistic process. For the first time in over a century, all 4 photographers stood together, their guard down, focused on teaching me their craft. That's when I made my move. While they were reflected in the pond, all grouped together for the first time in decades, I poured their own developing chemicals into the water, the stuff they'd been using for over 150 years to trap people. The pond turned silver like a mirror, and suddenly their reflections became solid while their real bodies started fading. The process was reversing. They were becoming the photographs while their reflections were becoming real. They tried to run, but they were already translucent, their feet sinking into the ground like they were being developed themselves. They dissolved into chemical fog, screaming in harmony, absorbed by their own pond. Every glass plate in the cave cracked at once. Thousands of souls released in a rush of whispers that filled the whole valley, voices saying "thank you" in languages and accents from across 2 centuries. I climbed out of that valley faster than I've ever climbed anything in my life. Didn't stop until I reached my truck. Didn't breathe easy until I was back on paved roads with cell service and GPS that actually worked. The only evidence I have is one photo on my phone that somehow survived everything. My reflection in the pond with all 4 Victorian photographers standing behind me. It went viral when I posted it, got picked up by paranormal blogs and creepy photo compilations. Everyone thinks it's photoshopped, and I don't correct them. I still do photography, but I don't go looking for hidden places anymore. Some places stay hidden for good reasons. The valley's still there. I've checked satellite images, and you can see the perfectly round formation if you know where to look. But no one else has reported seeing the photographers since. Sometimes I wonder about all those people whose souls got released that night. I hope they found whatever they were looking for. I know I found what I was looking for, even if it wasn't what I expected. These days, I stick to photographing things that are already well documented. Turns out there's plenty of beauty in the world that doesn't require risking your soul to capture. I was 28, just divorced, bleeding money for lawyer fees. When I took that security job nobody wanted. Name's Carla, and honestly, I was desperate enough to take anything that paid more than retail management. The divorce had cleaned me out. Legal bills, splitting assets, starting over in a crappy apartment. When I saw the posting for a night watchman position at some old coal facility up in Black Mountain, paying $22 an hour just to walk around empty buildings and check locks, I didn't ask too many questions. The job seemed straightforward enough. 12-hour shifts, 5 nights on, 5 nights off. The place was massive old processing buildings, rusted railroad tracks cutting through the property, and 7 mine entrances that had been sealed with concrete back in 1967. The company rep who hired me, this nervous guy in a cheap suit, kept emphasizing how easy it was. Just walk the perimeter, check the doors, make sure nobody's messing around where they shouldn't be. He handed me keys to a little trailer on site where I'd stay during my shifts. No cell service up there, but they had an emergency landline if anything serious happened. The day guard, Carl, was this weathered guy in his 60s who'd been working there for maybe 15 years. He always left before sunset, and the one time I got there early enough to overlap with him, he gave me some advice that didn't make much sense at the time. "They don't bother you if you don't bother them," he said, not really looking at me while he gathered up his thermos and lunchbox. When I asked what he meant, he just shrugged and said something about respecting the dead. I figured he was just one of those old-timers who got superstitious about industrial accidents. See, there had been a mine explosion in 1967 that killed 38 miners. From what I'd heard around town, the company sealed up Mine Hash 3 with the bodies sent ill inside, claiming it was to prevent the fire from spreading to the other shafts. Made business sense, I guess, even if it seemed pretty cold. The families had fought it, but back then, coal companies pretty much did whatever they wanted in these mountains. My first week went by without incident. Boring patrols around the buildings, listening to downloaded podcasts on my phone. Easiest money I'd ever made. The trailer was basic but clean, and I actually started looking forward to my shifts. No customers screaming at me, no managers breathing down my neck, just me and the mountain quiet. Sometimes I'd hear coyotes in the distance, or an owl, but mostly it was peaceful. That changed on night 9 at exactly 11:47 p.m. I was doing my routine patrol, walking past the sealed mine entrances with my flashlight, when I heard singing. Not like someone had a radio on. This was live voices, multiple men singing in perfect harmony. The song was "In the Sweet By and By," one of those old hymns my grandmother used to hum. It was coming from inside Mine Hash 3, clear as day, despite the concrete seal that had been there for over 50 years. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, just listening. The voices were distinct. I could pick out a young tenor, an older bass, someone with breathing problems who wheezed between verses. They knew every word, every harmony, like they'd been practicing together for decades. The strangest part was how the sound carried perfectly through solid concrete, like the seal wasn't even there. The singing lasted exactly 38 minutes, 1 minute for each dead miner, though I didn't make that connection until later. Then it just stopped, mid-verse, like someone had flicked a switch. The silence afterward felt heavier than before, if that makes sense. Over the next few nights, the pattern continued. Always at 11:47 p.m., always 38 minutes of singing. The songs changed, though. They'd start with hymns, then shift to old work songs, then children's lullabies. Toward the end, they'd sing something in a language I didn't recognize, something that sounded older than English, all harsh consonants and rolling vowels. I tried recording it with my phone, but all I got was static and the sound of rocks grinding against each other. Meanwhile, I could hear the singing clear as if they were standing right next to me. During those 38 minutes, the air around Mine Hash 3 would get thick, like being deep underground. My ears would pop, my nose would start bleeding, and I'd feel this pressure in my chest that made it hard to breathe. The temperature would drop 40 degrees, even in August. Ice would form on the concrete seal. On night 12, something changed. The voices stopped singing mid-verse and spoke in perfect unison. "Carla, come down, shift's starting." They knew my name. They knew things they shouldn't know, my maiden name, my daughter's birthday, the date my father died. That's when I really started to panic. The next morning, I cornered Carl before he could leave. Told him what I'd been hearing, watched his face go pale. He was quiet for a long time, then finally admitted his father had been the shift supervisor who survived the explosion. He was topside when it happened, checking on some equipment. Carl said his dad drank himself to death within 5 years, always saying he should have died with his men. They were trapped for 3 days, Carl told me, his voice barely above a whisper. Company had 4 hours to mount a rescue operation before the fire got too bad, but the board voted to seal it instead. Cheaper than a rescue. My dad recorded the sounds of them scratching at the seal, begging to be let out. He never got over it. That night I found a hairline crack in the concrete seal, fresh concrete dust on the ground. Each night after that, the crack widened. I could feel air flowing out, cold, stale, but impossibly carrying the scent of fresh coal dust. When I shined my flashlight through the gap, I saw perfectly preserved mining equipment, lunch pails with food that looked like it had been packed that morning. Carbide lamps were still burning after 50 years, which should have been impossible. I saw movement in there too. Shadows crossing my flashlight beam, human-shaped but wrong somehow, moving in stutters like frames of an old film reel jumping. I started researching the disaster at the local library, found old newspaper articles that told a different story than what I'd heard. The miners weren't killed instantly by the explosion. They were sealed in alive. The company had hours to save them, but chose not to because of the cost. They weren't ghosts. I realized that now. The mountain itself had kept them alive out of rage, preserved them in their betrayal. They'd been working the same shift for 50 years, never relieved, never allowed to go home. The guard before me had lasted 3 weeks. They found his car in the parking lot, keys still in the ignition, but never found him. I had a feeling I knew where he'd gone. On night 15, they gave me an ultimatum. 3 nights, they said in their unified voice. Then we come up. Someone goes down. Balance the books. On night 18, the entire seal crumbled. They stood at the threshold 38 miners in perfect formation, skin pale blue from oxygen deprivation, eyes coal black, covered in coal dust that never settled. They moved in synchronization like a single organism, heads turning together, steps in unison. Their watches were all still running, showing 11:47, the explosion time. The hands moved, but time never changed. The youngest miner, Timothy, spoke with all 38 voices. 50 years of shifts, never relieved. They wanted the board members' families, the same bloodlines that had sealed them in. Balance for balance. Thackeray. It's when Carl showed up. First time he'd ever come at night. He looked at them, looked at me, and said, "My father's debt has come due." He started walking toward the mine entrance. I tried to negotiate. Told them I could expose the truth, get it in newspapers, on the internet. Justice instead of revenge. But they laughed. 38 voices in perfect harmony. Justice died with us, they said. Only payment remains. They had names, addresses, descendants of every board member who had voted to seal the mine. Carl entered the mine, and the threshold sealed behind him. As he went in, the 38 miners walked out, but they were wrong now. Stuttering movement, not quite solid. For the first time in 50 years, they separated, each heading in different directions toward different towns. I had a choice: warn the families or let it happen. I tried calling emergency numbers, but most people didn't believe me. Some hung up. A few listened. The next morning, the news reported 38 deaths across 3 states, all gas leaks or carbon monoxide poisoning. Every victim was a descendant of the 1967 board members. They all died at exactly 11:47 p.m. The mine seal reformed overnight, stronger than before. Carl's name appeared on the memorial plaque next to the other miners. I quit that night, drove straight out of those mountains without stopping. The company offers triple pay for security now. No one lasts more than a week. Sometimes I drive past on the highway and see lights moving inside the mountain. I wonder if Carl's singing with them now, wonder if the debt's really paid. I still hear them in my dreams. 38 voices in perfect harmony, always starting their shift at 11:47, never getting to go home. To this day, I won't take any job that involves being alone at night. Some debts run deeper than money, and some shifts never end. I was 24, working as a home health aide when I got assigned to the Sweetwater Ridge area in North Georgia. My name's Jessica, and I'd been doing elder care for about 2 years at that point. Honestly, I thought I'd seen everything. Dementia, confusion, families that didn't visit, the whole sad mess of getting old in America. But that summer taught me there are worse things than dying alone in a nursing home. Way worse things. I got a 3-month contract checking on 5 elderly clients scattered around this remote mountain area, and the company even provided housing. Seemed like a good deal. Little farmhouse on Old Hollow Road, they said. Quiet area, they said. Perfect for someone who needed to focus on work. The house was small but decent enough, sitting by itself at the end of a gravel road that hadn't seen proper maintenance in years. What got my attention right away was the kudzu. I'd seen kudzu before. Everyone in Georgia has. But this was different. It covered everything like a thick green ocean, swallowing up abandoned houses, dead trees, rusted-out cars, even telephone poles. The vines hung so heavy they looked like frozen waves, and when the wind blew through them, they made this rustling sound that never quite stopped. It was like the whole mountain was breathing. My first client was Mrs. Chen, this tiny Korean woman who'd lived up there since the 1960s. Sweet lady, but when I mentioned how pretty the kudzu looked covering everything, she grabbed my wrist and said, "Don't walk in the kudzu after dark and never follow the singing." Her English wasn't perfect, but her tone was crystal clear. I figured it was dementia talking. Lots of my clients had confusion, paranoia about harmless things like neighbors or delivery drivers or stray cats. Mrs. Chen seemed sharp most of the time, but even the sharp ones had their moments. The thing about living alone on Old Hollow Road was the silence. No neighbors for 3 miles in any direction. Just me and that endless sea of vines rustling in whatever breeze decided to wander through. During the day, I'd drive to my clients, Mrs. Chen, Mr. Dockery, the Williams twins, and Mrs. Patterson. Do my rounds, check their medications, make sure they were eating. Normal stuff. Evenings, I'd sit on the porch with a book, trying to ignore how the kudzu seemed to move even when there wasn't any wind. For the first week, everything felt normal. I got into a routine. But on the 8th night, that's when I heard her humming. It started around midnight. I was reading in bed when this woman's voice drifted across the kudzu field, humming an old mountain ballad. Beautiful voice, the kind that makes you stop whatever you're doing and listen. But something about it wasn't quite right. There were no breathing breaks, no pauses where a normal person would take a breath. And it sounded like multiple women harmonizing, except it was coming from a single source somewhere deep in the vines. I got up and looked out my bedroom window. The kudzu had parted slightly where the humming was coming from, creating what looked almost like a path. It was inviting, but wrong, if that makes sense. Like when someone smiles at you, but their eyes are cold. The next morning, I found a vintage woman's shoe at the edge of my yard. 1950s style, black leather with a small heel, covered in this dried green sap that felt sticky even after it had hardened. I threw it in the trash and tried not to think about it. When I mentioned the humming to my clients, they all went quiet. Mrs. Chen just stared at me for a long moment and said, "She's hungry again." Mr. Dockery pretended he didn't hear me. The Williams twins started talking about something else entirely, but I caught them whispering to each other after they thought I'd left. I tried looking up the history of the area online, but didn't find much. What I did find were 13 missing women reports over the past 40 years. All from Old Hollow Road or the surrounding area, young women, middle-aged women, even a few elderly ones. The reports just stopped. No follow-ups, no resolutions, like people had forgotten about them. Each night, the humming got closer, and the kudzu started creeping past the property line I'd carefully cleared when I first moved in. I'd wake up to find new growth reaching toward my porch, toward my windows, like fingers testing the boundaries. On the 12th night, I saw her face. I was brushing my teeth when I looked out the bathroom window, and there she was, watching me from the kudzu field. A woman's face made entirely of woven vines, beautiful in an alien way. Her eyes were holes in the green, but I could feel her looking at me. When I blinked, she was gone. The next night, she called to me in my mother's voice. "Jessica, honey, I need help." Perfect inflection, perfect tone, except my mother lived in Ohio and hadn't called me honey since I was 12. The voice was coming from deep in the kudzu, from that same path that kept appearing and disappearing. I woke up one morning to find vines growing through the cracks around my windows, creeping under the doorframe, reaching toward my bed like they were searching for something. When I touched one, it wrapped gently around my wrist, not tight enough to hurt, but firm enough that I had to work to pull free. It left a green stain on my skin that wouldn't wash off no matter what I used. That's when I started to understand what she was. She wasn't hiding in the kudzu. She was the kudzu. The entire field was her body, and the vines were like her nervous system, her way of sensing and moving through the world. I'd see her weave herself into different shapes. Sometimes she looked like my sister, sometimes like my ex-boyfriend, always perfect except for that faint green tint to the skin and the way she moved just a little. Too smoothly. I found a deer skeleton one morning, half buried in the vines near my driveway. The bones had been sucked completely dry of marrow, cleaned so thoroughly they looked bleached. That's when I realized she fed on more than just plants. She needed calcium, protein, the minerals that keep us alive. My dreams started changing. I'd dream I was becoming part of her, roots for feet, chlorophyll running through my veins instead of blood. And the strangest part was how peaceful it felt in the dream, how right it seemed to just let go and become something else. Mrs. Chen finally told me the truth when the green stain started spreading up my arm. Her daughter had been taken in 1987, right around the same age I was now. She still saw her daughter's face in the kudzu sometimes, woven into the vines, still aware but not quite human anymore. Every morning, I'd find little sculptures at my door made entirely of kudzu vines, flowers, fruits, even a perfect replica of a cat, all impossibly detailed. They were gifts, I realized. She was courting me the way something that had once been human might court a potential mate or companion. I was getting weaker. The green stain was spreading, and I could feel her feeding on me through that mark, draining something vital. During the full moon, I could see human shapes throughout the kudzu field, covered in vines but still moving, still aware. Her daughters, I guess. her collection. She didn't speak in words, but I could understand her when the wind moved through the vines. She wasn't evil exactly, just hungry, lonely. She'd been there since before the settlers came, maybe since before the Cherokee. She needed daughters for strength, for company, for whatever passes as love when you're something that old and alien. The green lines were visible under my skin now, following my veins up toward my heart. I didn't have much time. Mrs. Chen gave me her daughter's diary from 1987. It described the taking, the slow integration process. Every 20 years, she needed multiple women. She'd already marked me and 3 others. This cycle. She needed 7 total. I tried everything. Herbicide just made her laugh with a dozen different voices, and the vines grew back stronger within hours. I set a small section of the field on fire, and she screamed loud enough to make my ears ring, but rain came from nowhere and doused the flames before they could spread. That's when she offered me a bargain. Bring her 3 more women, and I could go free. Keep the green mark as a reminder, but leave with my humanity intact. All I had to do was damn 3 other women to take my place. I was actually considering it. That's what scares me most, looking back. I was sitting on my porch at 3 in the morning, making a list of women I barely knew, women whose disappearance might not be noticed right away. That's when Mrs. Chen's daughter emerged from the kudzu. She was still partially plant, her skin green and bark-like, her hair made of tiny vines, but she was aware. She crawled to the edge of my yard and whispered, "Running water. She can't cross running water." There was a small creek behind my property. That's why the house was safe, why the kudzu never quite reached the back porch. She was bound by old rules, old limitations, that even she couldn't overcome. I spent the next day redirecting that creek, building a dam with rocks and fallen branches, flooding the kudzu field. It was back-breaking work, and I could feel her getting agitated, the vines thrashing like angry snakes. When the water started flowing through her root system, she formed herself into a massive woman shape, 40 feet tall, and screamed with voices I recognized, all the women she'd taken over the decades. As the water weakened her, the absorbed women started emerging, some from decades ago in various states of integration with the plant. Mrs. Chen's daughter crawled out, aging rapidly but alive, gasping, "Thank you," before she collapsed. And with the kudzu waterlogged and weakened, I managed to set it on fire. She screamed with 100 voices as the flames spread, but this time the water kept the fire burning. The smell was awful, like burning hair and rotting flowers and something else, something older and worse. But I could tell she wasn't dead. She'd retreated underground, her root system going deep into the mountain. I could feel her down there, waiting, recovering, planning. The green mark on my arm burned like a brand. I left Georgia that week, didn't even wait for my contract to end. I live in Arizona now, about as far from kudzu as you can get in this country. Desert for 1,000 miles in any direction, but I'm still connected to her. Sometimes I dream of her growing somewhere else, finding new hunting grounds, and the mark on my arm burns like fire. I check the news for missing women in areas where kudzu grows thick, and I wonder if I should warn them. Wonder if they'd believe me. Wonder if she's calling them with their mother's voices too. The mark never faded. Sometimes, on quiet nights, I swear I can hear her humming. Back when I was 21, I'd just finished my welding certification and was desperate for work. My mom had been sick for months, and the medical bills were piling up faster than I could handle with my part-time job at the auto parts store. That's when I heard about this road crew position in eastern Tennessee, doing emergency repairs on the mountain highways. The pay was decent, $35 an hour with hazard pay included. But there was a catch. It was night shift only, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., working on roads that most people avoided even during the day. I didn't care about the weird hours. Money was money, and honestly, I figured fixing potholes in the dark couldn't be that bad. The mountains around Coyote Gap were beautiful during the day, all rolling hills and thick forests, so I thought the worst I'd deal with would be some drunk drivers and maybe a bear or two. Looking back now, I wish that's all it had been. The crew was small, just 4 of us total. There was Dale, our supervisor, who was maybe 52 and had been doing road work since before I was born. He had this way of counting under his breath sometimes, like he was keeping track of something only he could see. Big Mike was 45, built like his name suggested, and had hands the size of dinner plates from years of heavy work. Then there was Tommy, who was 28 and had worked with Dale and Mike for about 5 years. They all seemed tight, like they'd been through something together that outsiders wouldn't understand. The first week went exactly like I expected. We'd show up at 11, get our assignments from Dale, and spend the night fixing whatever the day crew had marked for us. Potholes, busted guardrails, faded paint lines, routine stuff that just happened to need doing when there wasn't much traffic around. The work was straightforward, and the guys were friendly enough, though I noticed they didn't talk much about anything that wasn't directly related to the job. It was toward the end of that first week when Dale pulled me aside and gave me what he called the rule. He said it casual, like he was telling me where to find the good coffee, but his eyes were serious when he said it. "Tony," he said, "if you ever see another road crew working out there, even if they're in trucks that look like ours, don't acknowledge them. Don't wave. Don't honk. Don't even look at them too long if you can help it." I asked him what he meant by that, figured maybe it was some kind of union thing or territorial dispute with another company. But Dale just shook his head and said, "Night shift works alone, always has, always will. You just remember that, and you'll be fine." The whole thing seemed weird, but I needed the job, so I nodded and didn't push it. Tommy overheard and gave me this look, not unfriendly, but like he was sorry I had to learn about whatever this was. That should have been my first real warning sign, but I was young and broke and not thinking about much beyond my next paycheck. Second week started normal enough. We were working a stretch about 10 miles north of Coyote Gap, replacing some guardrail sections that had gotten damaged in a rock slide. It was around 2 a.m. when I saw them, another crew, maybe a mile up the road from us, working under the same kind of portable floodlights we used. I could see their trucks, their equipment, even the orange vests moving around in the distance. I pointed them out to Dale, thinking maybe our supervisor should coordinate with theirs or something, but he just glanced up and went right back to work. "Don't worry about them," he said, but I caught him counting again under his breath. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. What really bothered me was how they moved. Even from that distance, I could tell something was off about their rhythm. They worked in perfect T-sync, like they were all parts of the same machine. Tools would rise and fall at exactly the same time. Bodies would bend and straighten together. It looked like some kind of choreographed dance, except roadwork isn't supposed to look like that. Roadwork is messy and individual, with everyone finding their own pace. Tommy must have noticed me staring because he walked over and put a hand on my shoulder. "Tony," he said quietly, "don't look at their faces directly. Once you see yourself working up there, you become part of it." I thought he was joking at first, but the way he said it made my skin crawl. I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and went back to work. For the rest of that shift, I kept catching glimpses of that other crew in my peripheral vision, always moving with that same unsettling coordination. By week 3, I couldn't avoid them anymore. We'd been assigned to repair a section of road that put us right in their path. I was hoping they'd be gone by the time we got there, but when we rounded the bend at 11:30, there they were, blocking our work area with their trucks arranged in exactly the same pattern we used. Dale stopped our convoy about 50 yards back and just sat there for a minute, hands tight on the steering wheel. Through the radio, I heard him say, "Looks like tonight's the night. Everyone stay calm, do your jobs, and remember who you are." As we got closer, I could see them more clearly, and my blood went cold. It was us. Not people who looked like us. It was actually us. Same orange vests, same hard hats, same tools. The trucks were identical too, down to the dent in the back bumper of Dale's pickup that he'd gotten last month. But they moved wrong. Every motion was too smooth, too coordinated. And when I looked at the one who looked like me, God, I still get chills thinking about this. His face was mine, but aged, like he'd been breathing exhaust fumes and road dust for decades. His skin had this grayish tint, and his eyes were sunken in a way that made him look tired beyond anything I'd ever felt. The other Dale walked over to our truck, and when he got close enough, I could hear him talking to our Dale through the window. His voice was exactly Dale's voice, but flatter somehow, like it was coming through a bad radio. "You're early," he said. "Shift change isn't scheduled for another 17 years. Our Dale nodded like this made perfect sense. "We've got a new guy," he said, gesturing toward me. "Thought it was time he understood how things work out here." That's when the other Dale explained it to me, speaking like he was reading from a manual. They worked on 17-year cycles, he said, like infrastructure renewal. But instead of fixing roads, they were maintaining something he called the barrier. Sometimes both shifts existed in the same space, in different dimensions, making sure the boundary between them stayed solid. Big Mike had gotten out of the truck by then, and he was standing next to his double, both of them looking exactly the same except for something subtle around the eyes. Our Mike leaned over and whispered to me. "I switched once before, about 6 months ago. Nobody noticed for weeks. Half the time, I'm not even sure which Mike I really am anymore." Tommy showed me something that made my head spin. He had work logs going back to 1934, and it was always the same 4 names: Dale, Mike, Tommy, and whoever the new guy was at the time. The handwriting was identical across decades, like the same people had been signing in for almost a century. Every 17 years, one worker would switch dimensions, and somehow everyone's memory would adjust so nobody remembered who had been the original. The other version of me walked over while I was looking at the logs. He reached out and touched my hard hat, just a light tap with one finger, but the spot where he touched turned instantly cold. Not just cool, cold like metal in winter. Even now, 3 years later, that spot on my hard hat has never warmed up. After that night, things got strange fast. I'd start working on a section of guardrail at 11 p.m. and the next thing I knew, the sun would be coming up and I'd have no memory of the hours in between. I'd find myself moving in perfect sync with the rest of the crew sometimes, all of us bending down to pick up tools at exactly the same moment, breathing together like we were parts of the same organism. Dale's counting got worse. He'd mutter 1, 2, 3, 4 constantly, sometimes loud enough that we could all hear him. When I asked him about it, he said it was the only way he could stay anchored to this dimension, making sure there were still 4 of us instead of some other number that didn't make sense. The weirdest part was the work itself. We'd spend all night fixing a section of road, replacing broken asphalt, painting new lines, installing fresh reflectors. But when we'd drive past the same spot the next evening, everything would be broken again, like it had never been fixed. Then we'd fix it again, and the same thing would happen. It was like we were stuck in some kind of loop, doing the same repairs over and over for no reason anyone could explain. Some nights, cars would pass right through us like we weren't even there. Other nights, drivers would slow down and wave, clearly seeing us working. I started checking the traffic cameras on my phone during breaks, and half the time they showed empty road where we were standing. But we could see ourselves, plain as day. Mike showed me his driver's license one night. The issue date was 1989, and he looked exactly the same age in the photo as he did standing next to me. When I pointed that out, he just shrugged and said time didn't mean much once you understood what we were really doing out there. We weren't fixing roads for the drivers, he explained. We were maintaining the barrier between dimensions, keeping reality stable in this part of the mountains. Everything came to a head during my 4th week. The other Dale Anno unsaid that it was convergence night. Happens every 17 years, he said, and they had to trade someone to keep the balance. They'd chosen me because I was the newest, the least attached to this dimension, the easiest one to transfer without causing problems. Tommy and Mike grabbed my arms when I tried to back away. "We've lost too many new guys this way," Tommy said. "Not happening again." That's when our Dale stepped forward and volunteered himself. He'd been avoiding the switch for 3 cycles, he said, and he was tired. Tired of counting, tired of keeping track of which dimension he belonged to, tired of maintaining the barrier. For a few minutes, both crews performed the same task, replacing reflector posts along a quarter-mile stretch. Every movement was perfectly identical, like we were mirror images of each other. I couldn't tell who was the original crew and who was the copy, and I don't think it mattered anymore. I tried to run at one point, but the road just looped back on itself. No matter which direction I went, I always ended up back at the work site, with both crews still moving in that unsettling synchronization. Mike made the decision for all of us. He said he wanted to go back to the other side, that he remembered it being more peaceful, less confusing. So he walked toward their crew, and their Mike walked toward us, and they passed through each other like they were made of smoke. For just a moment, I could see everything. Hundreds of road crews spread across multiple dimensions, all of us working the same stretch of highway, all identical but slightly different, all maintaining different aspects of the same barrier. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time. The new Mike looked exactly the same as the old one, but something in his eyes was different, older somehow, like he'd seen more than any person should have to see. By morning, Tommy Coote didn't remember that we'd ever had a different Mike. As far as he was concerned, this had always been our crew. But I remembered everything, because of that cold spot on my hard hat. It marked me somehow, made me immune to the memory adjustments. I could see the changes that everyone else forgot. The only way out, I realized, was to find someone else to take the mark. Someone willing to work the night shift and ask fewer questions than I had. 3 months later, we hired Danny, a kid about my age who needed money for college. He was eager, hardworking, didn't complain about the weird hours or the strange rules. The night I was training Danny on proper reflector installation, I felt the compulsion lifting for the first time in months. The cold spot on my hard hat started to warm up, just slightly. When the other crew appeared and other Danny touched Danny's hard hat, I knew I was finally free. I quit the next day and took a regular day job doing maintenance for the county. Normal pay, normal hours, normal reality. No more 17-year cycles or dimensional barriers or crews that looked like mirror images of ourselves. Sometimes I drive past that stretch of road near Coyote Gap at night and I can see them still working under their portable floodlights. I can never tell which shift it is anymore, ours or theirs or some other crew entirely. They all look the same from a distance, moving in that perfect, unsettling rhythm. I wonder sometimes if I was ever part of the real shift or if I'm still out there working the night shift forever, and this normal life is just the dream. But I try not to think about it too much. Can't afford to, really. Some questions don't have answers you want to live with.